I will tell you where I was when I first heard about the woman on the breaks, and you will understand why I went. I was sitting in the back corner of Cutter's Ford's only saloon, a thin, joyless establishment that smelled of sawdust and old grievance, nursing a whiskey I had not paid for yet and listening to two men at the bar argue about a fence line. Not my fence, not my argument. I had ridden into Cutter's Ford that morning to deliver a letter for the Territorial Cattlemen's Association, for whom I did occasional work of the sort that is best described as finding things out, and I intended to deliver the letter, collect my fee, and be gone by noon the following day. That was the plan. I am telling you the plan so you will understand how badly plans sometimes miss. The two men at the bar were not arguing about the fence in any complicated way. One of them, heavyset, the kind of sunburn that comes from years outdoors rather than a single season, was saying that it was a shame about the Hollies' place, and the other one, younger, was saying it was not a shame. It was just the way things went, and nobody should have tried to hold 160 acres on the Cutter breaks alone, and a woman least of all. I did not say anything. I do not insert myself into arguments between strangers as a general rule. My business on the range has taught me that inserting yourself into an argument costs more than the argument is worth, and I had learned that lesson with interest. I sat with my whiskey and I listened. The heavy-set man, I learned later his name was Cord Abelson, who ran the livery and had opinions about most things and was right about most of them, said that Marin Hollies had been on those acres for 7 years, that her husband, a man named Thaddeus Hollies, had died of a kicked horse injury in the 2nd year, and that Marin had stayed and worked the homestead herself, which was not nothing. That she had run a small herd, kept a kitchen garden, and sold grass rights to 2 outfits who needed summer range. That she had paid her fees to the land office on time, every year, and had the receipts to prove it. The younger man said none of that changed the fact that the breaks east of Cutter's Ford were Voss Range now, or would be, and that the Hollies quarter section was sitting in the middle of it like a stone in a boot. I said, "Who's Voss?" Both men looked at me. Cord Abelson said, "Voss Land and Cattle, out of the capital. They bought the Tanner spread 2 years ago and the Reardon spread last spring, and now they've got range east and range west of the Hollies acreage. They want the middle section to run a continuous herd." The younger man said, "Which they'll get." I said, "How?" He looked at me in the way that men sometimes look at you when they consider the answer to be obvious. He said, "Same way it always goes. They send men. They make it difficult. Sooner or later, it's easier to leave than to stay." I drank my whiskey. I said, "What kind of difficult?" Cord Abelson said, "Poisoned water tank, cut fence lines, a stack of hay burned in August, which was her winter feed, and last month they filed a claim at the county seat that her original homestead survey was irregular." I said, "Was it?" He said, "No." I finished the whiskey. I paid for it. I went to the room I had taken at the hotel, and I lay on the cot in the dark and thought about a woman I had never met, holding 160 acres on a high, dry range against a land company that had already decided she was leaving, and I thought about the younger man's voice when he said "same way it always goes," with the ease of a man describing weather. I was in Cutter's Ford to deliver a letter. I had no commission on the Hollies matter. I had no instructions, no client, and no particular reason to ride east in the morning except the one I had, which was the thing I had found out about myself over 15 years of riding range alone. I could not hear a story like that and go to sleep. I was on the Breaks Road by first light. The Hollies homestead was 7 miles east of Cutter's Ford on a section of ground that was, I could see even riding in, good land. The high range was dry but not desert, the kind of dry that keeps the grass short and tough, the kind that cattle do well on if they're not pushed too hard. The quarter section sat on a bench above a creek draw, and the bench had the particular quality of ground that shelters from the worst of the wind while still catching the morning sun. Somebody had known what they were doing when they filed on it. The house was a solid log structure, not large but well chinked and tight, with a lean-to kitchen and a root cellar whose door was flush with the earth and solid looking. There was a barn, older than the house, and a set of corrals. The fence line along the south boundary had been cut. I could see the hanging wire from 50 yards out, and not recently repaired, which told me something about how the last few weeks had gone. I pulled up at the gate. A woman came out of the house with a rifle. Not in a threatening way, in the way of a person who has learned that visitors may or may not be the kind of visitors you want, and who has decided it is better to have the rifle in hand while you find out which kind these are. She was my age, or close to it. I was 37 that year, and she had dark hair gone partly gray at the temples, and the kind of face that has been weathered by outdoors and difficulty, and still holds its composure, the way good fence wire holds tension. She said, "I know who you are." I said, "I'd be surprised if you did. I only rode in yesterday." She said, "You're one of Voss's men. They've been sending different ones so I can't keep track." I said, "I'm not one of Voss's men." She said, "That's what they all say." I said, "My name is Ren Calloway. I ride for the Territorial Cattlemen's Association when they have work, and I was in Cutter's Ford to deliver a letter. I heard about your situation at the saloon last night, and I rode out this morning." She looked at me for a long moment. She said, "Why?" It was a reasonable question. I said, "Because the fence is cut and somebody ought to mend it." She said, "I can mend my own fence." I said, "I don't doubt it, but you've had other things to manage and it's been down a while." She looked at the south line fence and then back at me. She said, "I don't need charity." I said, "It's not charity. I can mend fence. You have a fence that needs mending. That's a transaction." She said, "What do you want in return?" I said, "Nothing tonight. I'd take breakfast in the morning if you were inclined." She held the rifle loosely and looked at me for another moment, the look of a woman who has learned to read the difference between a man who wants something and a man who does not, and who is not entirely certain which kind I was. I was not entirely certain myself. She said, "There's a barn. Your horse can use the south stall. Hay's in the loft, what's left of it." She paused. "The fence tools are in the shed on the west side." She went back inside. I unsaddled my horse, put him in the south stall, found the fence tools where she said they would be, and spent the remainder of the afternoon on the south line. The wire had been cut in 5 places, not by accident, not by weather, by wire cutters operated by a person who knew what they were doing and was doing it deliberately. I spliced and stretched and restapled, and by the time the light was going I had the south boundary back in order, which was not nothing but was also not the whole problem. I slept in the barn. At first light she had coffee on the stove when I came in from checking my horse, and she set a plate in front of me without ceremony, beans and salt pork and biscuits that were considerably better than anything I had eaten in Cutter's Ford, and she sat across the table with her own coffee and did not talk while I ate, which I respected. After a while she said, "The mended fence will be cut again within the week." I said, "Probably." She said, "So it was something to do but not a solution." I said, "No, not a solution." I drank the coffee. "Tell me about the land office claim." She looked at me. She said, "Why?" I said, "Because that's the part that concerns me more than the cut wire. The wire is harassment. A fraudulent claim at the county seat is a different category of problem." She set down her cup. She said, "They filed a petition saying my original survey was done under an expired commission, that the surveyor who ran the lines for my homestead filing in 1873 had let his territorial certification lapse the prior year, which would make the survey legally void and the filing irregular." I said, "Was his certification lapsed?" She said, "I don't know. I didn't know you needed to verify the surveyor's credentials when you filed. I assumed the land office did that." I said, "They're supposed to." She said, Voss has a man at the county land office, a clerk named Putty. He's been there 3 years. He came in after the Tanner purchase. I was quiet for a moment. I said, "You understand what they're doing. If the filing is declared irregular, your 7 years of improvements and fees mean nothing. The land reverts to territorial status, and they can file on it immediately." She said, "I understand exactly what they're doing." I said, "How long do you have?" She said, "The petition is scheduled for review at the end of next month." I said, "That's not much time." She said, "No." She refilled my coffee without asking and sat back down, and looked at me across the table with the direct, measuring look she had. The look of a woman who has been weighing situations by herself for a long time and has gotten good at it. She said, "You said you do work for the Territorial Cattlemen's Association." I said, "Sometimes." She said, "Do they know about Voss?" I said, "The letter I delivered yesterday was about Voss, or one piece of it. The Reardon purchase had some questions about water rights that the association wanted documented. I don't know how much they know about the Hollies situation specifically." She said, "Then somebody should tell them." I said, "That was my thought." We looked at each other across the table. She said, "Mr. Calloway, I need to be clear with you about something." I said, "All right." She said, "I am not a woman who can be helped out of her situation by a man riding in on a good horse. I have been managing this homestead for 5 years since Thaddeus died. I have managed it in drought and in a winter that killed half my herd, and in 2 seasons when the grass was short enough that I didn't clear enough on the hay to cover my costs. I'm not going to leave these acres because Voss Land and Cattle has decided they want them, and I'm not going to accept charity or protection as substitutes for the legal remedy that I am owed." She paused. "What I might be willing to accept is help with the legal remedy itself, if you know what you're doing, and if you can explain what you're doing while you're doing it." I said, "That's reasonable." She said, "Good. Then finish your coffee and tell me what the Territorial Association can actually do." I told her. She listened the way she did everything, without interruption, with her full attention, with questions that were specific and cut to the point. By the time we had talked the coffee cold, I had a clearer picture of what I was dealing with than I had had walking in, and she had a clearer picture of what the options were. Neither picture was entirely cheerful, but a problem you understand is smaller than a problem you don't, which is a thing I had found to be true across 15 years of working the range. The next 3 days I spent on the Hollies homestead, working and watching. I restrung the north fence line, which had also been hit. I checked the water tank, a stock tank in the east pasture fed by a spring, and found the evidence of what had been done to it. From the smell and the color of the soil around the outflow. Whoever had done it at night and done it carefully, but not carefully enough to hide all of it. I cut a section of the contaminated earth and bagged it. I found the remains of the burned haystack in the south field, and in the ash I found the neck of a coal oil bottle, which Marin told me had not come from her stores. I was building a picture. The picture was one I had seen pieces of before, in other places, under other company names. A systematic campaign to make a holding untenable, combining physical harassment with a legal maneuver that would give them title without appearing to take anything by force. It was a practiced operation, which meant Voss Land and Cattle had done this before. The clerk Putty at the county land office was the hinge of it. The survey irregularity claim was the kill shot, and Putty was the one who had the power to push it through. On the 4th evening, Voss's foreman rode out. His name was Lex Stroud, and he was the kind of man who had learned that a quiet voice and a relaxed posture can convey menace more efficiently than raising either. He rode up to the gate on a good bay horse, and he took his hat off, which was the kind of courtesy that is designed to seem civil while being the opposite. He said, "Mrs. Hollies, I was sorry to hear you're still having trouble out here, Mr. Voss wanted me to come by personally and let you know his offer is still on the table. Marin was standing on the porch. I was standing near the barn. Stroud had looked at me when he arrived and had not acknowledged me directly, which was a choice. She said, "I know the offer. It was inadequate when he made it, and it has not improved by sitting." Stroud said, "The survey petition moves to review in 22 days, Mrs. Hollies. If it goes through, the offer disappears. Mr. Voss would rather do this simply." She said, "Then he should withdraw the petition." Stroud smiled. He said, "That's not going to happen." He put his hat back on. He looked at me for the first time directly. He said, "You'd be Callaway, association man." I said, "Among other things." He said, "This isn't association business." I said, "I'm not here on association business." He said, "Then you might want to think about why you're here at all. A man who puts himself between Voss interests and what Voss interests want tends to find the range gets smaller." I said, "I appreciate the geography lesson." He looked at me for a moment longer than was comfortable for him, which was something I had found useful before, staying still until the other man moves. Then he nodded at Marin, turned the bay horse and rode out. When he was gone, Marin looked at me. She said, "They'll come back." I said, "Yes." She said, "At night next time. They won't come to the gate." I said, "No." She said, "What do we do?" I said, "We go to the county seat. We go before they expect us to go, and we go with everything we have." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "All right." We left for Harrowfield County seat 2 days later, Marin on her own horse, a steady gray mare she called Agnes, and I on mine. It was a day's ride. We stayed at separate establishments in town, which Marin had arranged without comment, and in the morning we went to the Territorial Cattlemen's Association's county agent, a man named Dix Faraday, who had been the association's representative in Harrowfield County for 6 years, and who listened to what I told him with the expression of a man hearing a story he has been expecting to hear. He said, "We've had questions about Voss before, the Reardon water situation." I said, "The Hollies situation is further along. The survey claim goes to review in 20 days. He said, "What do you have?" I laid it out. The lie in the water tank and the soil sample, the coal oil bottleneck from the burned haystack, the cut fence wire taken from 5 locations with clean cuts that matched commercial wire cutters rather than breakage, and the timeline Marin had kept dates, incidents, witnesses where she had them, which was not many because she was alone out there, but which was something. I had her receipts for every land office fee paid on time since 1873, and I had the thing that I had found at the Harrowfield Land Office Records room, which I had spent an afternoon in after Dix Faraday told me where to look. The original Survey Commission records showing that the surveyor who had run the Hollies homestead lines in 1873 had held a valid territorial certification through the end of that year, not a lapsed one. The Voss claim was built on a date they had gotten wrong or had chosen to misread, depending on how charitable you felt about it. Dix Faraday looked at the commission record for a long time. He said, "This makes the petition frivolous." I said, "It makes the petition fraudulent. A frivolous petition is an error. A petition built on a date the petitioner had access to and misrepresented is something else." He looked at me. He said, "You're going to want to be careful about that word in a formal proceeding." I said, "I'm careful about it, but I'm also accurate about it." Marin said, "What does the association do with this?" Dix said, "We take it to the Territorial Land Commissioner. Today, if you'll let me make a copy of the commission record, we request an emergency stay of the review pending investigation of the petition itself." He paused. "If the commissioner acts, the review doesn't happen on schedule." She said, "And if he doesn't act?" He said, "Then you go to the review with this documentation, and you make the same argument in front of the review board. It's stronger than anything they have." He looked at both of us. Mrs. Hollies, I want to say that what you've been dealing with out there, the tank, the haystack, the fence, that is a pattern we've seen from Voss land and cattle in 2 other counties. We have not been able to move on it before because we did not have documentation, and we did not have someone on the ground willing to testify. He paused. Are you willing to testify if it comes to that? She said, I have been willing to testify since August when they burned my hay. We were back on the road to Cutter's Ford that evening. The sun was going down across the high range in the particular way it does in that country, wide and flat, and turning everything orange for about 20 minutes and then going to dark fast. We rode mostly without talking, which was comfortable. The way silences are when you have spent enough time alongside a person that the silence is its own kind of speech. She said at some point on the road, "Thank you." I said, "We haven't won yet." She said, "No, but we've done something. Before you came, there was nothing to do but hold on and wait for the legal clock to run out. Now there's something to do." She paused. "That matters." I said, "Yes, it does." We rode into the dark for a while. She said, "Callaway." I said, "Wren." She said, "Wren, when this is over, when the claim is dismissed and the Voss situation is resolved one way or another, what do you intend to do?" I said, "I generally ride to the next thing." She said, "Is there a next thing?" I thought about that. I said, "Not at the moment." She said, "I'll need help with the water tank. The spring needs to be retested and the outflow rerouted to make sure the contamination doesn't come back. And the north fence will need proper posts. The ones I put up in the 2nd year are going soft." She paused. "I'm not asking you to stay. I'm telling you what the work is." I said, "That's a fair amount of work." She said, "It's a working homestead. There's always a fair amount of work." I did not say anything for a while. The range was dark on both sides of us, and the stars were coming up over the breaks in the particular thick way they do when you're far enough from town that there's no light to compete with them. My horse found his footing on the road without needing much from me, which is the mark of a good horse. I said, "What would I sleep?" She said, "The barn is adequate. I would not offer you the house, because that is not an appropriate arrangement and I run a proper homestead." I said, "I wasn't asking about the house." She said, "I know you weren't. I was clarifying." I said, "The barn is fine." She said, "Good. Then there's work for you if you want it." I said, "All right." We rode on. She did not say anything more about it and I did not either, and it was enough. The next 12 days were not easy. Dix Faraday moved faster than I had expected. He had the Territorial Land Commissioner's office in 4 days, and the commissioner, to his credit, issued a stay of the review pending investigation of the petition's factual basis. Voss Land and Cattle's county attorney filed a countermotion the following day, which was expected. What I had not expected, but should have, was that Stroud would bring 3 of his men out to the breaks on the 10th night. I heard them coming. I had been sleeping light since the foreman's visit, light enough that the sound of horses on the bench road at 2 in the morning brought me out of my blanket and to the barn door without needing to think about it. There were 3 of them, coming in dark, no lanterns, riding slow the way men ride when they are trying not to be heard and are not as quiet as they think they are. I stepped out of the barn door. I said loud enough to carry, but not so loud as to panic a horse, "Whoever you are, you're on Holly's land and you've been heard. Turn around." They stopped. I could see them in the starlight, 3 men, one of them Stroud by his build and the way he sat his horse. Stroud said, "Callaway." I said, "You know who I am. You know there's an active stay on the survey petition and a territorial investigation open. Whatever you rode out here to do tonight adds to that file." There was a silence. One of the men behind Stroud shifted his horse. I said, "I'd ask you to think carefully about whether what you're being paid to do tonight is worth what it's going to cost." Another silence, longer. Stroud said, "You can't hold this place by yourself." I said, "I'm not by myself. Cord Abelson from the livery is riding out at first light with 2 association witnesses who are sleeping at the ford tonight. Whatever happens here is going to have names attached to it." That last part was not entirely true. Cord Abelson had agreed to come at first light, but the association witnesses were my own invention, which is the kind of invention that can be useful in the dark. Stroud did not know what was true and what wasn't, which is the same advantage I was working with. He sat his horse for a while longer, then he pulled it around. The other 2 followed. I listened to them ride back down the bench road until I couldn't hear them anymore, and then I went back inside the barn and sat against the south stall wall and breathed until my heart slowed down. In the morning, Marin came out to the barn early. She said, "I heard them." I said, "I figured." She said, "You handled it." I said, "So far." She looked at me, the same measuring look, but with something different in it now, something that was not gratitude exactly and not relief, but something quieter and more settled than either. She said, "Come have breakfast." I said, "All right." Cord Abelson did ride out that morning, as it happened, with a note from Dix Faraday. The Territorial Land Commissioner's office had formally requested the original Survey Commission records from the Harrowfield County Land Office for independent review. The clerk Putty had produced them. The records showed what I had already found, a valid certification through the end of 1873. The date discrepancy in the Voss petition was now a matter of official record. Dix's note said, "Voss's county attorney withdrew the survey petition this morning. The review is canceled." I read the note twice. I handed it to Marin. She read it. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she folded it carefully and set it on the kitchen table, which was a thing I had seen her do with documents she intended to keep. She said, "It's over." I said, "The petition is over. The investigation into the harassment campaign is ongoing. Dix wants depositions from both of us about the tank, the haystack, the fence cuts. That'll take time, but the land is yours. The filing stands." She said, "It was always mine." I said, "Yes, it was." She went to the window and looked out at the bench in the October light, the grass pale gold, the fence lines I had restrung standing straight, the corrals empty but solid. She was quiet for a long time. I sat at the table and did not crowd her, because she was the kind of person who needs room to feel a thing, and I had figured that out about her. She said, "Thaddeus and I came out here in the spring of 1873. We had the survey done and we filed and we broke ground that first summer. He said the bench had the best grass in the county and he was right, but we didn't know yet whether the winter would be survivable. It wasn't an easy first year." She paused. "He died in April of the second year. Kicked horse on a morning I was inside doing the accounts. I heard him fall." I said, "I'm sorry." She said, "I've had 5 years to be sorry." She turned from the window. "I stayed because this was the thing we made. I didn't see a reason to let it go." She looked at me. "You understand that?" I said, "I do." She said, "You don't have a thing you made." I said, "No, I've been moving too long for that." She said, "Is that by choice?" I thought about it honestly. I said, "It was for a long time. Then it started to be habit, and habits are harder to see clearly than choices." She said, she came back to the table and sat down and poured us both more coffee, and for a while we just sat with it, which was something I had gotten comfortable with over the past 2 weeks, the specific comfortable silence of 2 people who do not need to fill every space between them. She said, "The water tank work, the fence posts. That'll run into November if you do it properly." I said, "Probably." She said, "And then there's the deposition work with the association. Dick said he'd need us available in Harrowfield at least twice more before the end of the year." I said, "That's reasonable." She said, "So you're here through the end of the year at minimum?" I said, "It appears so." She said, "And after that?" I did not answer right away. I looked at the window she had been looking out of, the bench, the fence lines, the pale October grass, the cutter brakes running east under a sky that was the particular clear blue of high country in autumn. I thought about 15 years of riding between one thing and the next and never being sure, when I pulled up in a new town, whether I would stay long enough to learn the name of the street I was on. I said, I don't know what comes after, I know what's here. She said, what's here? I said, good ground, a tight house, work I understand, a woman who told me on the second morning that she didn't need charity, which was the truest thing anybody had said to me in a long time. She looked at me for a moment. She said, that is a practical inventory of a situation. I said, I'm a practical man. She said, you are not as practical as you think. A practical man does not ride 7 miles to mend a stranger's fence for breakfast. I said, I told you. It was a transaction. She said, it was not a transaction. Transactions have equal value on both sides. Breakfast does not equal 7 miles of fence. I said, it was very good breakfast. She looked at me, and something moved in her expression that I had not seen before, something that was the first version of a smile, which on Marin Holly's was not a large or easy thing, but was entirely genuine, the way hard-won things are. She said, Callaway. I said, Wren. She said, Wren, I am going to say something that I have been considering for 10 days, which is longer than I generally take to decide things, and you are going to let me say it without interrupting. I said, all right. She said, I have been on this homestead for 7 years, 5 of them alone. In that time, I have managed everything that needed managing, and I have not looked for company or asked for it. I did not write to the Territorial Association, and I did not send to Cutter's Ford for help. I held the line alone because that was what there was to do. She paused. And then you rode in and mended my fence without being asked, and slept in the barn, and spent 10 days building a case at the county seat, and stood in the dark in my yard in the middle of the night, and sent 3 men back down my road. She stopped. I don't know what to do with that. I said, you don't have to do anything with it. She said, I know I don't. That is not what I'm saying. She folded her hands on the table. What I'm saying is that I would like you to stay. Not because the fence needs posting or the tank needs routing, though both of those are true. Because I have spent 5 years being entirely sufficient to myself, and I have found it to be both true and not enough, and you are the first person who has sat at this table long enough for me to find that out. She looked at me. That is what I'm saying. You can do with it what you want. I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, I'd like to stay. She said, all right then. She got up and began clearing the coffee cups, which was her way of concluding conversations that had arrived where they were going, and I sat at the table and looked out at the breaks and thought about the night 2 weeks ago when I had lain on a cot in Cutter's Ford with a whiskey paid for, and a letter delivered, and a plan to be gone by noon, and how badly, in the end, the plan had missed. We stayed the way we were through the end of October, working the homestead, completing the depositions for the association, rebuilding what had been broken. The water tank was flushed and the spring rerouted to a clean inflow. The fence posts went in along the north line in the last week before the ground hardened. By November, the Hollies homestead looked the way it should have looked without 7 months of deliberate harassment behind it. Tight, prepared, in order. In November, Cord Abelson rode out from Cutter's Ford with 2 things: a copy of the Territorial Land Commissioner's formal ruling dismissing the Voss land and cattle survey petition with prejudice, and a bottle of rye whiskey, which he said was for the occasion. We drank it at the kitchen table, the 3 of us, and Cord told us that Voss's county attorney had resigned the Voss account, and that Stroud had been seen riding west out of Harrowfield County on a Thursday morning, and had not been seen since. Voss land and cattle's territorial expansion, he said, had gotten complicated by the association's investigation. There were two other situations in other counties that had now opened up based on the pattern Dix Faraday had documented. I said Voss himself. Cord said, still in the capital, still has money, but his local operations are shut down at least for now, and the people he put in place, putty at the land office included, are under review. He raised his glass. To Mrs. Hollies, who held the line. Marin said, to the people who helped hold it. She looked at me when she said it. I drank my glass and did not say anything, which was the right choice for that moment, which is something I am still learning, when the right choice is to let a thing land without adding to it. Cord left before dark. The evening came on cold and clear, the first hard freeze of the season settling over the breaks, and Marin lit the fire in the main room, and we sat on either side of it with the work of the day put down, which was a thing I had not done in a long time, sat somewhere without moving on from it. She said, there's a question I've been meaning to ask you. I said, ask it. She said, the association witnesses, the ones you told Stroud were sleeping at the ford that night. I said, yes. She said, were they? I said, no. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, so you stood out there in the dark with 3 men who didn't know that? I said, yes. She said, that was a gamble. I said, it was the best option I had. She said, what if it hadn't worked? I said, then we'd have had a different kind of problem, and I'd have handled it a different way. She said, you handle things. I said, I try to. She said, you're calm about it. I said, I've been in enough tight places that the calm comes with experience rather than confidence. There's a difference. She looked at me across the fire. She said, you've been doing this a long time. I said, 15 years. She said, alone. I said, mostly. She said, and you stopped. I said, apparently. The fire settled. Outside, the wind came across the breaks from the north, the first real winter wind, carrying what would be snow by morning. Inside, the room was warm and tight and still, the way a well-built house is when the weather is doing its worst outside and the work has been done, and the evening has nothing in it that needs to be addressed. She said, Calloway. I said, Wren. She said, Wren. She looked at the fire for a moment. I'm glad you heard about the fence that night. I said, so am I. The snow came in the night. In the morning, the breaks were white and still, and the fence lines ran clean and straight across the bench, and the water tank sat clear in its new outflow, and the barn was solid, and the house was warm. I saddled my horse after breakfast, not because I was going anywhere. I had nowhere to go and was not planning to, but because the horses needed exercise, and I rode the south fence line to check the winter state of the posts, which were solid, and the north line, which was the same, and came back in the mid-morning to find Marin at the root cellar taking stock of the winter stores. She said, how are the fences? I said, solid. She said, good. She marked something in the small ledger she kept for the cellar inventory. There's a section of the east wall on the barn that'll need attention before the real cold comes. I was going to get to it in October and didn't. I said, I'll look at it this afternoon. She said, the timber is in the south shed. She looked up from the ledger. You know where everything is now? I said, more or less. She said, less than more, but you're learning the place. I said, I am. She said, it takes time to learn a place. You have to be there for it. I said, I know. She went back to her ledger. I went to look at the east barn wall, which was not as bad as she had worried but would need 2 new timbers and some chinking before the deep winter settled in. I made a list in my head of what was needed and went to the south shed and found the timber and began. It was the kind of work that is entirely absorbing, precise and physical, and with a clear result, and I worked through the afternoon while the snow melted off the bench in the thin winter sun, and the cattle moved in the south pasture. At some point I understood, working on that wall, that I was not going to ride out of the cutter breaks in the spring, that the thing I had told Marin at the kitchen table, "I know what's here," was not a temporary accounting of the situation, but the truest thing I had said in a long time about my own life. I had been moving for 15 years because moving had been the shape my life took, and I had not examined the shape carefully enough to notice when it stopped fitting. The shape that fit now was this: a bench above a creek draw in high country, a house with a tight roof and good chinking, a woman who ran her accounts in a small ledger and held a rifle in the proper way and did not beg and did not pretend, and had told me on the second morning that she didn't need charity while she refilled my coffee. That was the shape of it. I was staying. I finished the barn wall as the light was going. I went in and washed, and Marin had supper on, beans and salt pork again, which I had eaten enough of in the past weeks that it had become a kind of comfort, the way familiar things do when you stay long enough to make them familiar. We ate. We talked about the east pasture rotation in spring and whether to buy 2 more head before the price went up in April, which was a question that assumed I would be there in April, which I was, and which she was assuming too without either of us needing to say so directly. After supper she said, "I want to say something." I said, "All right." She said, "I have been thinking about what I said at the kitchen table when the petition was dismissed, about wanting you to stay." I said, "I remember." She said, "I meant it plainly. I don't say things I don't mean plainly." I said, "I know that." She said, "Good, then I'll say this plainly too." She looked at me across the table. "I would like this to be a proper arrangement in time, not immediately, but in time." I said, "A proper arrangement." She said, "A marriage, when we know each other well enough that it's the right thing and not just the convenient thing. I am not interested in convenient arrangements. I am interested in the right thing." I said, "How long does that take, do you estimate?" She said, "I don't know. I've only done it once and that was different circumstances." She paused. "I would say spring. If we get to spring and both of us are certain, which I expect we will be, then spring." I said, "That's reasonable." She said, "It is." "I'm a reasonable woman." I said, "You are the most reasonable woman I have ever met." She said, "You say that like a compliment." I said, "It is one." She looked at me for a moment, and the same thing moved in her expression that had moved before, not a large smile, but a real one, the kind that costs something and is worth it. She got up and cleared the plates, which was how she ended conversations that had arrived where they were going. I sat at the table for a while after, listening to the wind on the breaks and the fire in the grate and the sounds of a house at the end of a winter day. My horse was in the barn. The fence lines were solid. The spring would be good grass. We were married in April, at the Cutter's Ford Church, by the same circuit preacher who came through every 2 months and who had a practical view of frontier unions, and did not make them more complicated than they needed to be. Cord Abelson stood for us, and Dix Faraday rode up from the county seat, and Marin wore a gray dress she had sewn through the winter that was practical and fine in equal measure. She did not cry. I did not either, but I came closer than I have ever been willing to admit to anyone, because when she said the words she said them the same way she said everything, directly, without ornament, looking at me, and the weight of them was the weight of everything they meant, which was considerable. Afterward, riding back to the homestead in the April sun, with the breaks going green after the snow and the grass coming up strong along the creek draw, she said, "The north fence will need one more check before we run the cattle up." I said, "I'll look at it in the morning." She said, "And the east pasture gate latch is loose. I've been meaning to have it looked at." I said, "I'll do that too." She said, "You're going to be busy." I said, "I generally am now." She looked at me sideways, the way she had gotten in the habit of doing, a look that contained more than it showed, which was the particular way of a woman who has learned to keep her own counsel and has chosen with some care to share it. She said, "You don't mind?" I said, "No." I don't mind. She looked forward again, at the bench and the homestead coming into view around the last curve of the bench road, the house solid against the sky, the barn solid beside it, the fence lines running clean and straight across the good grass of the Hollies quarter section. 160 acres that had been worth fighting for and had come through it whole. I had ridden into Cutter's Ford to deliver a letter. I had heard a story in a saloon and ridden 7 miles east on no particular authority, and mended a fence in the October light, and somehow that had been the beginning of the only thing I had ever done that I did not want to end. A man does not always know, when he makes a choice, that it is the one that will define everything after. Sometimes he only knows later, looking back, that there was a moment when his life divided into before and after, and that the before and after were entirely different countries, and that the after was where he belonged. That is how it was for me. That is how it was.